But first, we're going to Brother Jay, Brother Johnson, Floyd Johnson, and Coach, he's been around for a long time, a great guy.
42 years he's been at BYU. He's the first equipment manager they had. He's worked with the football programs, the basketball programs. He's worked with all of the athletic teams. He's as fine a man as I know or have ever met. He's just is so service-oriented, unselfish, loves all people unconditionally, and is a great asset to our program.
Well, let's meet Brother Jay.
I thought it'd be really important and nice for all of Utah to have an opportunity to meet Floyd Johnson. We refer to Floyd as Brother Jay. Come on and let's meet Brother Jay. Hi, Brother Jay.
Hi.
How are you,
Coach?
I thought we'd come in and check out your surroundings here and give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about what you do. You can see that there's equipment for the men's and women's programs here. And Brother Jay does a great job taking care of it. Brother Jay, why don't you just tell us for just a moment a little bit about what some of your responsibilities are?
Well, right now my responsibilities is to see that the game stuff is clean, ready at all times, to take care of the practice gear, to see that that's cleaned. And I do a little different than anybody else. That's the material side of things. I like to see that they're taken care of spiritually as well. So as you can see, I have my scriptures all open here, and when the players come in, we may sit down and we'll talk about the scriptures, we'll talk about their girlfriends or boyfriends, just to get acquainted with them. It doesn't take a whole lot of knowledge to wash the clothes. But you have to have a little love and a little wisdom for the people that you're working with if you're going to have any kind of an effect upon their life. You can say what you want. I've heard Coach Cleveland out there, but you know the love that he has for the players has more effect upon those players and their ability to play and their desire to play than all the diagrams and all of the lectures that he ever gives, because they love him and they want him to feel good about them. And so they will do everything they can to play for him and to make him proud of them. And I feel that's exactly the same way here in what I have to do.
Classic Brother Jay. He was there when I was at BYU. He was down at the football area back then, and they've moved him up now specifically and exclusively at the Marriott Center. So you guys are lucky to have him.
We are. He's a sweet man and just so helpful. Everything is just always in order, and if it's not, he'll let us know. And I've learned a great deal from Brother Jay, and I think so have all the players. And he's just a great person to have around, and you know, we want him to be there for as long as he wants to be there.
We've got a kind of a theme going right now, guys behind.
We want to recognize on the stand today, this evening, the stake presidency, along as with the presidencies of the young men and young women of this stake, people who care about you and love you. Our program will go as follows. Opening prayer will be given by Tyler Barker. Then we'll have a special music number by David Warner. He'll be accompanied by Delise Coles, and he will sing "I'll Walk Today Where Jesus Walked." And then we'll have an introduction to our speaker, and then our closing prayer will be given by Courtney Leishman. Brother Barker. Coles, that was absolutely excellent. I might remind you that there are refreshments to be served in the cultural hall subsequent to this meeting, but the big treat will soon come be with you. In life, I have found that one of the great opportunities is to run onto people who have great testimonies. And if you have one of those persons as a friend, then your testimony increases. Brother Johnson was born in Wellington, Utah, the third of the four sons of Victor and Enid Johnson. They soon moved to the Orem Pleasant Grove area where Brother Johnson grew up. He served a mission in the East Canadian Mission, whose headquarters were in Montreal at the time. And then he came back to Utah, soon got married, and worked in various areas. But eventually in 1957, he took the job as equipment manager at Brigham Young University. Now, at that time, it wasn't a very appealing job. But Brother Johnson made literally lemonade out of lemons. And he took that job very seriously because he felt he was working in the Lord's university and doing the Lord's work. And since that time, there have literally been hundreds, if not thousands, of young men and women who have been favorably affected in their life by what he has had to offer unselfishly. And it's been my good fortune to see him in many actions. And I've always found him to be literally a man of Christ. It's our pleasure then to hear from Floyd Johnson.
I'm grateful, brothers and sisters, for this opportunity. Every time I go into a building, a church where they have a movable pulpit, I have a desire to want to occupy that first seat. Because I just like to sit there and move that pulpit up and down as that person was trying to talk, because it seems like so much fun. I hope you enjoyed that music as I did. It was beautiful. Now, I never hope that I'll walk in the steps that Jesus walked, but I hope that I can think the thoughts that Jesus thought, because that gives something to my soul. And I'm grateful to be here with you tonight, and grateful for Brother Bear. He's been a faithful servant to help me out down there for nearly 30 years, and I appreciate that. As I was sitting here thinking, my mind went back to a couple of football players that came to BYU about 1970. One of them was named Paul, and the other was named Orrin. One was from Orem, Utah, and the other was a graduate from Granite High School. They had never given much consideration about going on a mission. And I'm the wrong man for them to come in contact with, because I'm really pro-mission. I served a mission, and I think every young man ought to serve a mission. We talked a little bit about missions. They had never thought about it. After being at BYU for about 3 weeks, they each returned to their own home. And lo and behold, it so happened that each of their bishops called them in and talked to them about thinking about a mission. They were only 18 years of age, so they had a year to think about that. They came back, they told me about their interview. They weren't too impressed. So we made an appointment for them to talk to a general authority. They talked to Brother Paul Dunn. Now, he's the wrong man to talk to about a mission, because he felt just like I did. But he told them they should start now. He said, every team you play, you ought to pick out someone on that team, get him aside and ask him the golden questions. I said, you know the golden questions? Oh, sure. We've been the president of our senior seminary class. We've talked about missionary work. I said, well, that's good, because in 2 weeks you're going to play the Air Force Academy over in Colorado Springs. And that means that someone on that Air Force Academy team, you're going to get aside and you're going to ask him the golden questions. They said, that's right. I said, how are you going to do this here? Well, you know what the Lord told Nephi, that he'll never ask you to do anything unless he prepares a way for you to do it. So he'll prepare a way for us to do it. And their faith was so great that at least every morning or every other morning, they were in talking to me about a program that they could set up where they could get an Air Force Academy football player off the side and ask him the golden questions. We left for Colorado Springs on a Thursday. There was no set program. First, they decided they were going to wander around the campus and grab the littlest cadet they could find and pull him off into a corner and ask him the golden questions. I said, well, he has to be a football player. Oh, yeah, they hadn't thought about that. Then they decided they'd stand in front of the Air Force Academy dressing room. And when the right candidate came along, why, they'd grab him, pull him around the corner, and ask him the golden questions. But they hadn't talked to Coach Edwards, and they couldn't get free. And all during the first half of that game, that was on their mind. Who were they going to get to ask the golden question to? At halftime, while the coach was doing a chalk talk, they were in a corner going over number by number and pound by pound every player on the Air Force Academy football team to see if they couldn't get a little inspiration. It didn't come. Midway through the third quarter, one of them was a defensive tackle and the other was a defensive end. Colorado took the offense. The two players came off the team and the big tackle went up to the big end and he said, I know who it's going to be. The big end said, who? The big tackle said, the quarterback. He only weighs 175 pounds. And when we go back on the field, they're going to try to run that football, and we're not going to let them do it. That means on third down, they're going to have to pass. And one of us is going to get him on the ground. And the guy that gets him on the ground is going to ask him the golden questions. The big end said, well, that'll be me. I was a hurdler in high school, and I'll hurdle over that guy who's trying to block me. The big tackle said, well, you got to move fast, because that guy in front of me thinks I'm blind in one eye because I turn the same way all the time, but I'll fool him. They were hoping that BYU would fumble so they could get on their mission, and BYU fumbled. And they went back out on the football field. Colorado the Air Force Academy went into their offensive huddle. BYU went into their defensive huddle. The two players stood side by side, patting each other on the seat of the pants, saying, now's the time, boy. Let's get this here mission accomplished. In 2 downs, the Air Force Academy only made 2 yards. It was third down, 8 yards. They had to pass the ball. The Air Force Academy used a T formation, and the quarterback was right behind the center. BYU lined up in their defensive stance. The quarterback got the ball. He faded back to one side of his defensive pocket, but no one was open. He moved to the other side, but he didn't make it. That 260-pound defensive tackle grabbed him and threw him on the ground. And he'd no sooner got him on the ground than that 240-pound end fell right on top of him. There we were, he told me later, 500 pounds of priesthood on that little old Gentile. The big tackle said I had my face mask buried right into his old nose guard, and it looked like his eyes were going to pop right out of his head. And I said to him in the best missionary voice that I could muster, "What do you know about the Mormon Church?" And the little quarterback tried to clear his mind and shake his head a little bit and clear his eyes. And finally he said, "Plenty, plenty, get off from me. I'm a Mormon." Brothers and sisters, in 42 years at the university, I've had some great experiences working with those athletes down there, both the men and the women. There's something about the spirit of the Y that gets to you. It's the same today as it was 42 years ago when I started. You just want to be better. When I first started there, we didn't have as many good Latter-day Saints as we do now. In fact, returned missionaries were very rare indeed in the athletic program. First returned missionary I ever remember was LeGrand Young, the father of Steve Young. And I remember when he went on his mission, our coach was a non-Mormon, cut him off scholarship because he didn't want him to go into the mission field. And then in 1958, when he came back again, he was denied his scholarship. But he was just as bullheaded as his young son is. He decided he was going to walk on, and he did, and he made it. I'll never forget LeGrand Young because he kind of inspired me that he was a champion for our Heavenly Father. And so tonight I want to talk to you just a little bit about the shoe of a champion. You should be a champion for our Heavenly Father. Brother Bear has put all these shoes out here. I'm not going to talk about all of them. I remember once George Albert Smith making the statement that a long man couldn't give a short talk. And when I see a speaker, I always kind of estimate how tall he is because I know how short and how long the talk's going to be. But they've warned me that there's a trap door here, and if this meeting isn't over in time, you'll be out in time, but I won't. I'll be someplace else. The shoe of a champion. Shoes have many different parts. The eyelet, the tongue, the inner soul, the outer soul. And so does the shoe of a champion. There is a shoe that has the part of faith, of virtue, of knowledge, of patience, of love, of charity, diligence. So as I talk to you tonight about shoes, we're talking about the shoe of a champion. I want you to mentally be trying these shoes on. There's a problem with new shoes. They wear blisters. I want to know if these shoes are going to wear a blister on your feet. And if you can learn to wear the shoe of a champion, then you can walk in the path that Jesus walked. The shoe here is the shoe of Steve Young. He doesn't know I have this shoe. He came up one day missing his right shoe. And he came in, he said he was missing his right shoe. I said, that's too bad. I gave him a new pair of shoes because Steve Young is learning to wear the shoe of a champion. Steve came from Greenwich, Connecticut in 1978. He was a left-handed quarterback, and we had never had a left-handed quarterback, particularly one like Steve Young, who couldn't throw the football. He could run good, but he couldn't throw the football. He had a good arm, but it wasn't very strong. After about a month in football practice, he was approached by the quarterback coach. Steve, I think you ought to play in a different position. How about being a defensive back? That didn't appeal to Steve. His teammate was a big tight end by the name of Gordon Hudson from Salt Lake City. They came in to see me. The coach wants me to be a defensive back. I don't want to be a defensive back. The next day, the coach said to him, Steve, tomorrow when you come out from practice, will you wear a white jersey? In practice, the offense wears blue. The defense wears white. Steve knew that he was going to be on the defensive team. That night when he and Gordon got into their dormitory over at John Hall, he said, I'm going to call my dad. I'm not going to be a defensive back. I'm going home. So he put a call in collect. His mother answered the phone. Mom, this is Steve. Yeah, I knew when the call came collect who it was from. Is Dad there? Yes, he's standing right here. Can I talk to him? Yes. Are you all right? Oh, I'm fine. LeGrand Young came on the phone. Dad, this is Steve. Yes. What can I do for you, son? Dad, they want me to be a defensive back, and I don't want to be a defensive back. I'm going to quit football, and I'm going to come home. There was a long pause, dead silence. Steve said, are you there, Dad? Yes. Can you hear me all right, Steve? Yes, I can hear you. Steve, whether you play football or not, that's up to you. But if you quit, you can't come home. Because I don't want a quitter in my family. Did you hear me, Steve? I heard you, Dad. Goodbye. And the phone went dead. And Steve sat there for a little while. Finally, Gordon spoke up. He said, what did he say? He said, whether I played football or not was up to me, but if I quit, I couldn't come home because he didn't want a quitter in his family. Gordon said, well, I don't think I'll call my dad. They made a trip later on that night up to the home of Lavelle Edwards. They had a long talk. The next day, Steve went out onto the practice field with a blue number 8 on because Steve Young wore the shoe of diligence and perseverance. He was willing to pay the price. And I don't believe there's an athlete in the whole church that has influenced people and done as much for young people as Steve Young. He told me when I saw him last, there was one regret in his life, and that was that he didn't serve a mission. He said, I think if I'd gone into the mission field, my life would be complete. I look at Mike, I look at Tom, I look at Cliff, my brothers. They have something that I don't have. And I have that regret, but I'm trying to make up for it. Do you wear the shoe of perseverance? Do you wear the shoe of obedience as Steve Young wears? This is a basketball shoe. The man that wore this has been the most popular basketball player that ever played for the Brigham Young University. He's from Yugoslavia. His name was Krešimir Ćosić. He had an urge to play basketball, to play fast break basketball. And someone told him, an American who was visiting Yugoslavia, that the best coach for fast break basketball was at the Brigham Young University, whose name was Stan Watts. And if he wanted to learn to play fast break basketball, he ought to go to Brigham Young University. A correspondence was started. The first thing I knew, Coach Watts brought Kreshmer Chosik back into the equipment room. I looked at a man 6 feet, 11 inches tall. There was no fat on that frame at all. And his hair had never been properly introduced to either a brush or a comb. I would swear that he must have been 8 feet tall. But he came to the Brigham Young University. He wouldn't live on campus. He lived down at a motel by the Hotel Roberts in Provo. The Marriott Center was just in the thinking stage at that time. They were getting ready for plans, hoping that within a couple of years they would be in the Marriott Center. I don't know how many times I walked outside of that field house door in the hallway to have a young girl standing out there who was not a BYU co-ed, but she would be holding a plate of cookies. And unfortunately, they were all wrapped in cellophane. But on the top was always a note. She said, "How can I get these to Kreshmer Chosik?" I said, "Well, I can put them in his locker." She said, "Would you do that?" I said, "Yeah," looking very longingly at that plate of cookies, and put them in his locker. I was horrified to find out that all those notes contained addresses and telephone numbers where Kreshmer could contact this young lady. And that next May, when he went back to Yugoslavia, that thing was foremost in my mind, and I prayed to God that Kreshmer Chosik would never come back again. That maybe halfway across the Atlantic Ocean, he'd have a desire to take a long walk and just not come back. But come back he did. The next year wasn't quite so bad. No more cookies were delivered. If the girl was out there, I didn't see her. The next year, we moved into the Marriott Center. It was in October. I was out to a sporting goods store in Orem picking up some athletic gear. The manager said to me, "I hear Kreshmer Chosik's been baptized." I laughed. "Are you kidding? I know who's baptized and who isn't. They'd never baptize that guy. They ever got him in the water never stopped boiling." When I got down to the Marriott Center, I could hear voices in the training room. Rod Kimball was our trainer, and Kreshmer Chosik was lying on the table getting his ankles taped. Rod said, "Kreshmer, what you think if I tell you that I be a Mormon?" I waited for that answer because Rod and I had talked before. "Kresh, if you ever get to be a Mormon, I'll apostatize." "Then, Kresh," said Rod, "one thing we Mormons don't like is a man who say he do something and then he not do it." And every day when he came to basketball practice, he would go into Rod to see if Rod was still a member of the church. That May, when he went back to Yugoslavia, he came to me and wanted some T-shirts to take with him. All I had were T-shirts that the players had turned in for new T-shirts. They were soiled. They were holy. I said, "That's all I have, Kresh." He said, "I take if they say Brigham Young." He gathered up nearly 100 to 125 of those T-shirts. I didn't know what he was going to do with them. I found out later. He had had the Articles of Faith printed up in the Croatian language. And as he walked the streets of Jadar, his hometown, the young kids would come up to him and say, "We want a t-shirt like you. You want a t-shirt like me?" "Yes, how can we get a t-shirt like you?" And then he'd reach into his pocket and pull out one of these cards with the Articles of Faith in the Croatian language. "You read what is on this and you come back and report to me, then I get you a t-shirt." That was a pretty cheap baptism, a holy t-shirt for the Articles of Faith. Marshal Tito was the dictator. Yugoslavia was a communist country. They didn't like what Krešimir did, but they couldn't do anything about it because Krešimir was a hero, and they didn't dare interfere with their heroes. When he graduated from the university, he went back to Yugoslavia. I remember he had a contract offered him for the Los Angeles Lakers, something like $300,000, which was a tremendous amount in that day and age. And there was another contract from the Indiana Pacers for $280,000, but he turned them down because there was no one in Yugoslavia to teach those people about the gospel. And when he got home, they decided the best thing to control him was to put him in the army. That didn't work. He began teaching his buddies about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the word would get back to the army leaders, and eventually he was released and sent back to Jadar. They could handle him better. Krešimir Ćosić, this great man who spent 4 years at the university, who ended up as an ambassador from the nation of Croatia to the United States. He died about 5 years ago of cancer. I'll never forget him. I blessed him so many times in my prayers because Krešimir Ćosić wears a shoe of conversion. Nothing could stop him from teaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is another football shoe. This young man came from Las Vegas, Nevada. You wouldn't know him. I can tell you his name. His name is Keith Rivera. He came in about 1970. He had been raised in the casinos. His dad was a card dealer. And all Krešimir, or all Keith knew, was what he had learned in the casinos. He spent only 3 weeks in the dressing room when he came to me and he says, "I don't like those guys I'm dressing with." I said, "Oh, you got another dressing room that I can use?" They had started calling him Mad Dog Rivera. I said, "Sure, I can put you back with the gymnasts and with the wrestlers. The lockers are a lot smaller. You'll have to have 2 lockers. That means you're going to have to remember 2 combinations." "That's fine. I just don't want to dress with them out there." So I took him back and put him in the locker room in the back. We finished our freshman year, our sophomore year, our junior year. When he came back from his summer vacation to begin his senior year, he walked into me. He said, "Floyd, I'm back." I said, "Yeah, I can see you're back." "I'm changed. I'm just like putty. Mold me any way you want to mold me, because I want to change. Can I move back into my old locker?" I said, "Yeah, no one has been in that locker since we moved you out." so I moved him back into his old locker. The name Mad Dog still stuck, but he'd kind of liked it by now. The third game of that season, he hurt his ankle. This was in 1974. We were to go to a bowl game that year, our first bowl game ever in the history of BYU. The doctor gave him one of two choices. Have an operation, which would mean his football career was over with. 2, he could take a shot of Novocaine, a painkiller, because he couldn't hurt his ankle any worse than it was. He chose the second option. I remember that fourth game was played at our stadium. I remember seeing him lying on the table waiting for Dr. Vance to insert that long needle into the joints of his ankle to deaden it so he could play. I remember seeing standing around his table 4 of his teammates, Paul, Orrin, Wayne, and Stan. I heard Stan say to him, "Keith, when he puts that needle into your ankle, you grab our hands and you squeeze for all you're worth, and you won't feel a thing." I stood back. I wanted to watch this. I wasn't one of the volunteers. He grabbed their hands. I saw their hands go white where the blood was being squeezed out. I saw the grimaces of pain on their face. I looked at Keith. He was smiling while the doctor inserted that needle into his ankle. They carried his pain. They were the ones who felt the pain, not Keith. And 5 other times that year, that process was repeated because Keith Rivera was learning to wear the shoe of love. And he was teaching that to his roommates, the shoe of love. Can you wear the shoe of love? Does it fit comfortably on your foot? Now I'll take this last shoe. This is a football shoe of way back in the 1960s, worn by the first black player that ever played football for the Brigham Young University. It was in that day and age when Mormons were not too popular. Our wrestling team had gone to Seattle, Washington, and were kept in their dressing room under a police guard because of militants. The gymnastic team was down in Portland, Oregon, and asked to return home for their own safety. The basketball team had been in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the playing floor had been surrounded by militants waving lighted torches. And the next night they were in Fort Collins, Colorado. There was a decision. Should BYU give up sports? I remember that was talked about on campus because there were no black players. And that summer there came from Chicago, Illinois, the news that there was a black Latter-day Saint. His name was Paul Devine, that he was a football player, that he was driving a taxi cab. It was a pretty good football player. And one of the coaches made a trip to Chicago, Illinois, found the cab that Paul was driving, stepped into the cab and he said, "Take me around. I just want to talk to you. I'll pay for the fare." Ask him how he'd like to come to the Brigham Young University and play football. Paul thought he was dreaming. That was one of the dreams of his life. Paul Devine came to the university. He was married and had 2 children. Every Monday night, his family would spend family home evening with me, my wife, and our family. I heard his story. Paul was born in the ghettos of Chicago. His mother died when he was just young, and his father died later, and Paul was left an orphan. He had brothers and sisters, but there was no room for him, and so he was left on the street. He said, I used to find my food in garbage cans. I used to sleep at night behind a garbage can, hoping that nothing would harm me during the night. And then when I was old enough, in fact, I hadn't turned 17 yet, somehow I was able to lie myself into the United States Army. And after my boot training, I found myself over in West Germany. I had a bitter attitude. How could you have anything, he said, but a bitter attitude when you were raised like I was raised? I was out to get everything I could get, even from the United States Army. Some buddies and I would go down to the YMCA and we'd play basketball. It was more football than it was basketball, but we'd play. And I hadn't been there too many times until I noticed another soldier who was seated along the sidelines. He would never play with us. But when we were resting, he would take his ball and go out there and shoot baskets. He was different. I saw him around the camp. He was different. And it got my curiosity. And one time before he could get off his seat when we were resting, I walked over to him and I stood right in front of him and I said, hey man, how come you're different? He looked at me and he spread out his hands and he said, different? I'm no different than anyone else. 2 hands, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 eyes, a nose and a mouth, just like anybody else. Paul said, I didn't give an inch. I looked right down at him. And I said, I've been watching you. I see you around the camp, and I don't hear you say the things that I hear other soldiers say. I don't see you do the things that I see other soldiers do. Man, you're different. With that, he reached out his hands and he pushed Paul back. He said, oh, if you mean that way. I'm different because I belong to the true church of Jesus Christ. And when you belong to the true church of Jesus Christ, and when you keep the commandments of God, it makes you different. And it's made me different. And Paul said there was an urge that came to me, and I looked up at him and I said, I want to go to the true church of Jesus Christ. And he shook his head and he said, And then before I could say anything, he said, I don't want you to just go. I want to take you. You be ready next Sunday morning at 10 minutes to 9. And I'll take you to the true church of Jesus Christ. Paul said that was on a Wednesday. I knew he didn't mean it. He had just said that to get me off his back. But Saturday I polished my shoes and I pressed my uniform. I was getting all ready for Sunday morning. And Sunday morning I got up again and I repolished my shoes and I repressed my uniform. And all the while I knew he wouldn't show up. But at 10 minutes to 9 I heard a whistle. And I looked outside the barrack door, and there he stood. He was always carrying 2 little black books. And he had those 2 little black books. And I grabbed my cap, and I put it on my head, and I went out the door, and I walked toward him, and he didn't wait for me. He come walking toward me, and he reached out his hand, and he said, you want to go to the true church of Jesus Christ? We're going. And we started down the sidewalk, and we hadn't gone 50 feet until he stopped and he said, would you like to carry one of my little black books? He said, it sure would. I didn't know what I was carrying, so he handed me a little black book, and it was just like the little black book that he was carrying. We were companions, each of us carrying a little black book. And I went to the True Church of Jesus Christ, and I sat there for over an hour, and I didn't understand the word that they said because everything was in German. And then when we got back out on the sidewalk, we stopped, and he looked down at me, and he said, Paul, how did you like that? And I looked up at him and I said, I didn't understand a word they said. Everything was in German. He said, oh, forgive me, Paul, that's not what I meant. How do you feel? And I didn't want to tell him because there was a feeling in me like I had never felt before in my life. A feeling of joy, of happiness, and of peace. And I'd never had those feelings in my life before, and I didn't want him to laugh at me. And he waited for a minute, and he said, Paul, how do you feel? And I said, you won't laugh at me? He said, no, I won't laugh at you. And I told him how I felt. He said, Paul, that's the Spirit telling you that you've been to the True Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Paul said, within a short time, I was baptized a member of the church. And that's the best thing I've ever done in all my life. Paul Devine, he also wears the shoe of love and of charity because Paul Devine paid the price. Now, I want to spend just a minute with you about your shoe, your feet. In the middle 1960s, we had a big track meet at the university. We had a new stadium, a new track. It was beautiful. A royal blue track made out of rubber asphalt with white lines. And the NCAA was going to have their track meet there with nearly 500 athletes from all over the United States. That track meet was to begin on a Thursday and to run 3 nights in succession. On a Monday of that week, I got a call from the airport in Salt Lake City that there was some electronic gear up there, and would I please come and get it out of their way. I made the trip to Salt Lake City. I put that gear in my little van, took it back to the stadium, locked it up under the west bleachers in the second level. I forgot about it. Wednesday at noon, there was a telephone call from a man who said his name was Wilson. He was from the Bowl of a Watch people. He was trying to find his electronic gear, and they couldn't find it. If this university was like other universities, someone had stolen it, and he needed to know. I went over and I found Mr. Wilson. I took him under the west bleachers to that room on the second level. His gear was there. It had not been touched. It took him a few minutes to check it over, and he said, everything's okay. I said, fine, let's lock it up. You won't need it till tomorrow. As we stepped out of that room, he turned to me and he said, you care if I smoke a cigarette? There was a sign on one of the big steel pillars there that said, thank you for not smoking. I pointed to that sign. He said, you're telling me I can't smoke? I said, I didn't say anything. I just thought you could read that sign. Just like I've heard about you Mormons. You know, I've flown over this state 100 times, and I prayed to God I'd never have to come here because I've heard about you Mormons. He said, I've been in Salt Lake City since last Sunday night because I didn't want to come down here. And I thought to myself, does he know who's up in Salt Lake City? I didn't say anything to him. I said, Mr. Wilson, will you get into my van? I'd like to take you on a little tour. I took him around the campus and I named the buildings off to him. They were named after prominent church leaders. The Bishop's Storehouse then was in Center Street, or Main Street in Orem. right on the corner of Center Street. We ended up out to the Bishop's storehouse. He was going to get an education. We walked around the Bishop's storehouse, and I'd pull off the cans and look at the labels, and I said, here's a can of peas. This was canned in California. Here's a can of beans. These were canned in Orem, Utah. Orange juice from Arizona. There was grapefruit juice from Florida. We ended up over to the meat counter. The butcher took and cut us off each a slice of cheese. The church makes the best cheese. It's almost worth going on welfare to get a piece of that cheese. He ate his cheese and he smacked his lips and he said, I'd like to buy 3 pounds of that, please. And the butcher looked at me. And he looked at Paul, looked at Mr. Wilson. I finally said, Mr. Wilson, you can't buy cheese here. He said, this is a store, isn't it? I said, yes, this is a store, but you'll notice there's no cash registers here. They have no need for money. This is for those who need it. Now, Mr. Wilson, we could take care of that. I'm a bishop. I could take you down and baptize you. Then I could interview you, and if I found you were needy and worthy, we might be able to get you some cheese. That didn't go over too well, and by that time, the butcher had cut him off another 3 pounds of cheese and wrapped it up and gave it to him. The next morning at 7 o'clock, this was Thursday morning, Mr. Wilson was back into my office. He had a couple of buddies with him. Will you take us on another tour? I said, sure. I didn't tell him I wasn't going back to the Bishop's storehouse. I took him on a tour, same tour I took before, even down to the motion picture studio. We didn't have to rely on Hollywood, we had our own studio. The next morning, which was Friday, he came back again. He was alone. Will you take us on another tour? Or take me on another tour? I said, sure. As we got into the car, he said, you know, it's pretty sneaky of you Mormons. I said, oh, is that right? He said, yeah, I've noticed the kids going to school here, how clean and how well-dressed they are. Boy, you must have put out a pile of money to bring them in and give them a bath and a haircut and get clean clothes for them just to impress us. I looked at him for a minute and I said, Mr. Wilson, do you think these kids are window dressing? He said, listen, Mr. Johnson, I have been to every major university in the United States, and you don't see kids like they're on this campus. Anybody could see that's a put-up job. I took him on his tour, and then when we got back, this thing had been eating at me. I said, Mr. Wilson, I challenge you to walk the paths of this university and talk to the young people. Find out where they're from. Find out who paid their tuition, why they're here, who bought their clothes. Yeah, and who gave them a haircut. Saturday, he came back again. Take me on another tour. I can't believe it. It's the darndest thing I've ever seen and heard of in all my life. I must have talked to 50 kids. I talked to kids from foreign countries. They've all paid their own tuition. And they bought their own clothes. It's for real. I said, yes, it's for real, Mr. Wilson. That night, I took Mr. Wilson to the airport. He needed to be in Bakersfield, California the next morning. On our way, he said, Mr. Johnson, my life has really changed. You know how I asked you if I could smoke? I said, yeah. He said, you know, I haven't smoked a cigarette since I arrived here. He said, Mr. Johnson, I have a daughter in junior high school. I'd give anything if she could get out to a university like this, but you don't take non-Mormons. I said, oh, yes, we do. About 10 or 12 or 15% of our student body are not members of the church. But Mr. Wilson, you wouldn't want her out here. I wouldn't. No, because if she came out here, we'd probably baptize her, and you don't want her to be a Mormon. If she could be like the young people, the young girls I've seen on this campus, I'd be the happiest man in the whole world. That's because they were like you. How many people go through this valley, drive this neighborhood, and make a judgment of the church on what they see in you, how you walk, what you do. And they're either inclined to want to know more. And if they see a bad example, they're just going to say just what I thought. Because you must learn to be a champion for our Heavenly Father, to walk in His path, to think His thoughts, to understand Him and to know what is expected of you. And then you can be a champion for our Heavenly Father, and that ought to be the goal of every one of us. For the gospel of Jesus Christ is true. It is genuine. It is God's way back into His presence. And all we have to do is to follow His commandments and to walk in the path of Jesus. I leave my testimony with you and thank you for your kindness and for the invitation to be here tonight. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.